So let's see. I think we are ready to bring Will on. There he is, the man himself. Welcome, Will.
Oh.
Will Coleman joined us, gosh, just even less than a year ago, Will, right? June of 2019. It seems like a lifetime ago in our current situation. And he came to us from the Newark Museum, where he was, and I want to suddenly have lost your page that I had so carefully printed out. Here we go. So I make sure I get the right title, where he was the associate curator of American art and had done some fascinating work there and had worked with a few of our National Advisory Committee members as well in that capacity. But I first met Will when I had joined Olana shortly afterwards. I think it was February of 2016 at the annual College Art Association conference, which is the biggest gathering of professional art historians, academic art historians, and curators in the country. And it was in Washington that year. And there was a special, I almost felt like it was a day, but a series of sessions on the Hudson River School and its legacy, and Will was one of the presenters there, and a very fascinating talk, which I think maybe a few points will filter in today, maybe not. But Will has completed his PhD in art history in 2015. With a dissertation that focused on painter architects, and he has taught at Berkeley, where he got his PhD, but also Washington University in St. Louis. And he's also had a number of internships, including with Eleanor Jones Harvey at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And our wonderful guest, was it just last week, Will, that Eleanor was here?
Yeah.
Time in captivity just seems to either be really fast or be in some other mode. So, Will, I turn over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Sean, and thank all of you for spending some time with Ilana tonight. Let's hope that all the tech behaves itself. I trust that Margot will text me if audio isn't behaving or anything. So let's jump right in here. I'm very glad to get a chance to share some of the research that brought me to Ilana, as Sean says, just over a year ago. Yeah, it's been a very full year, but this has long been a dream job for reasons that you'll see in this talk. I've been thinking about this place for a long time, and I'm going to share some of that thinking today. A kind of prehistory of Olana that I think makes this place all the more interesting and all the more important. We've called this series that I'm joining and helping to fill the spots in Olana Perspectives, and it includes all these personal perspectives on parts of the Olana universe, topics that touch on Frederic Church and Olana in various ways. And this will be no different. This is my personal approach to this place, and this is suggests some of the principles that will guide the work we're doing behind the scenes in collections and exhibitions, caring for this incredible place. As Sean says, my particular perspective and history is in this phenomenon we call the painter architect. This is a term that may be new to you, but it has a long scholarly history and a long history of use in Europe as well as in the United States. And one of the contributions I'd like to make today is to insert Frederic Church more fully into the history of the painter architect on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that we who dearly love Olana sometimes run the risk of celebrating all that makes it unique to such an extent that we make it an anomaly, that we separate it off from the cultural context that gives it meaning, that indeed gave rise to it. So I'm going to suggest some of the cultural currents that led this place into existence, not in the least diminishing its specialness. On the contrary, hopefully helping to show why it looks the way it does, why it is positioned the way it is, why it is filled the way it is, why it was used the way it was. Just a few topics here. You'll see a coy suggestion of some of the topics that will be coming up later here in the title slide. Peter Paul Rubens in the 1600s in what is now Belgium at the left. William Birch, really interesting artist in early 19th century Philadelphia at right. And I think he's going to be a particularly interesting precedent for Frederic Church in a number of ways. So if you'll bear with me, I promise that the conclusion of this talk that will go in many different places, many different times, is that Olana is special, maybe in some ways you didn't know, that Olana is tremendously important to the world. There's no place like it, but there are ways we can understand how it came into being. So that's a little statement of purpose here. My goal would be to break down this concept of Olana streaking across the sky like a meteor in Frederic Church's own painting of the meteor of 1860, this brief flare from the darkness that turned some heads as it went, but then receded into the void. So I think this lovely painting that used to hang at Olana is an apt metaphor for the risk. We don't want an Olana that is merely a spectacular flash in the sky that goes away soon after. We want an Olana that is built upon a mountain of evidence, a mountain of inspiration, and a mountain of precedent to a certain extent, even though Olana is unique and very special. I'm going to turn to some places quite far from the Hudson Valley to begin. I'm not going to touch so much today on something that some of you have heard me talk about before, which is the painterly use of Olana, this concept of recursive landscape that I spoke about in a talk earlier this year. I'm going to take this exactly the opposite side of the same coin. Not how a house creates landscape painting, but how landscape painting practice creates a burden of inherited cultural memory and a goal of building a house like Olana that Frederic Church is the only person to fully realize. There are many dreamers, there are many attempts, there are fits and starts in many different times and places, but Olana is this supreme realization of what so many had dreamed of. In approaching the prehistory of Olana, I am speaking largely about Euro-American context today. That's partly a product of time and of my own past research, but there's a lot more work to be done, both on the state park side and on the top side. One little verbal footnote here is that there is a whole other interesting story of this well-loved patch of earth before the Church family arrived, and indeed before Europeans arrived. And that's a story that we can all do a better job of telling, and we'll have to report back to you in some future lecture on that topic. There's also a story of the creative country life in other parts of the world than the European American context. And I'll share very briefly one of those contexts here. I'll come back to that previous slide, but this is a really useful example in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts that reminds us that this kind of striving and dreaming, of which Olana is this remarkable example, was not limited to the European and American context that I'll share with you a little later. There is this whole rich tradition of the painter scholar in China that reached a really high level of refinement, and a core part of that tradition, the literati painter, was construction of spaces specifically for the pursuit of your scholarship, of your learned refinement. And this is an example of that tradition, the kinds of spaces that would have been cultivated for creative practice in the Chinese tradition. So I wanted at least to share that with you. I flashed past a slide that was included, again, to gesture towards the recursive landscape of Olana, this whole past topic, and something that I think we're doing pretty well with these days, thanks to the Olana Eye. This is a story that in the past has perhaps not been as well told as it should be, but we're well on top of it now. Olana as this anchor for a globe-trotting artist, an artist who is most associated with Petra, icebergs in the Arctic, South America, far-flung places. But we at Olana know well that this particular view that you can see 24/7 via the Olana Eye and in this lovely oil study at left was important in a different way to Frederic Church, that when he did achieve this dream of the creative country life, he used it for a kind of daily practice, nearly daily. He said in his own correspondence correspondence, making a study from his studio window like this one. I think of him a little bit like a musician who has a daily discipline of practice, who has to flex those muscles of coloristic thinking to stay fresh and to keep on understanding this one particular place. So thank goodness we have this incredible new technology in this time so that we can all, even those of us working from home, be at Olana and see this view that was so important to Frederic Church. So I'm going to trot along here and share some other evidence with you. I've got a lot of caveats to start, and I wanted briefly to gesture toward the houses of writers. Even though we're going to be talking mostly about painters today, at least one of these will be known to most of you because it's not too far from the Hudson Valley. Just a few examples of many really interesting and inspiring houses of writers that have been built over the years that we see American 19th century artists explicitly referring to, people whose work they were reading and admiring, examples of domestic practice that carried over into the world of painting that interests us particularly at Olana. So Sir Walter Scott's Abbotsford is a fascinating example. I'm convinced that Sir Walter Scott, who you may know from Ivanhoe and these great romances, he is more important to the Hudson River School than many people understand. I see references to his work throughout the correspondence of Thomas Cole. We see him, I believe, in Frederic Church's library. Ida will have to fact check me on that. I know Ida Breyer, our ever knowledgeable archivist and librarian, is listening, so she will be the font of knowledge there. I see so many references to Scott, both as writer and as this example of a creative personality who achieved great distinction in the way he conducted his domestic life at Abbotsford on the Scottish borders. Closer to home, Washington Irving, building a house that commemorates his fascination with the Dutch colonial era, claiming this kind of descent and ancestry and antiquity for a very young country, a much reproduced house that has its own rich visual culture. But without further ado, I want to turn to the houses of painters. So here we have the architectural practice of Raphael. I want to talk about first. One of these early European examples. We also know Michelangelo, who's contributing to St. Peter's, one of those many different figures over a century or more who are contributing to the realization of St. Peter's. Sculptors like Bernini, painters like Michelangelo, all of these people for whom it is perfectly natural to pick up and put down architecture when it's convenient. And it's not merely domestic scaled architecture, but the grandest of civic buildings. That were par for the course for a gentleman of letters. And regrettably, this is mostly a gentleman's practice in this era. There are not many women in this period who are given that space to operate in this man's world, but we'll start to see that changing a little later. Raphael, Michelangelo in the Italian Renaissance are building remarkable buildings that have survived. Lower right there is the Villa Madama, now the country house of the president of Italy, I believe, and now it's tarnished with all these associations with the Silvio Berlusconi era and these bunga bunga parties that he had there. Don't ask, but yes, the Villa Madama there, a remarkable house designed by someone who we primarily think about as a painter. So there's this backstory that people like Frederic Church were conscious of. We can document this. We are aware that there's this cultural inheritance and this ideal that's being passed down in Western culture, at least from this date. We could also go back farther, even to ancient Greece and Rome, the creative country life, another rich tradition there. Pliny the Younger had two fascinating villas that were places for the pursuit of his learned studies. So there's this long history on the Italian peninsula that will carry forward all the way into the 19th century Hudson Valley. Giorgio Vasari is a very useful example here because he was not merely painter, but also writer, somebody who ensured that his legacy would persist through being his own narrator through writing the lives of the artists and becoming a pioneering art historian, really, writing biographies of the major painters of his time and ensuring that his own story would continue to be told. So Vasari here, not only operating as a domestic architect for himself at the Casa Vasari in Arezzo, which you'll see on the right, but also completing great civic buildings. One of them formerly civic offices, the Uffizi, literally offices, now the Uffizi Museum there that you see on the left above the Arno. So Vasari is a source of a very clear line of descent that we can trace to people like William Dunlap, pioneering biographer of Cole and others, an American following in this model of the artist biographer. And the fact that architectural practice was a core part of Vasari's legacy is received with that literary and historical legacy, I would argue. Peter Paul Rubens shows up in a lot of talks I give, as people who've seen me speak before know, because he was the subject of my master's thesis, and I think that he is a really important precursor for a lot of American landscape practice, and this may come as a surprise. Peter Paul Rubens, whom you may know for the appropriately adjectively described Rubenesque paintings of great religious subjects, very dramatic Baroque paintings filled with figures, flourishes of light and drama and flowing drapery, was 2 points, both an architect and a great landscape painter, and a landscape painter whose paintings were collected in England, where those paintings were seen by traveling American artists, and we have a really clear line of descent there. So I've shown here the exterior and interior of a building for which Rubens was a key consulting architect, not the sole architect building this structure, but one of the major architects who were behind this major civic building in Antwerp that still stands there. We know also that Rubens was building a number of works of lost architecture, and that will be, unfortunately, a recurring theme here. He made fascinating triumphal arches for a ceremonial entry of an archduke of the period coming into Antwerp on one of these great visits. And in wood and plaster, Rubens throws up this temporary, fleeting architecture for which we have only surviving drawings. But we see further evidence that he was following on into the 1600s in that mode inherited from Raphael and others as the citizen of the Republic of Letters, the public intellectual for whom it is perfectly legitimate to practice architecture alongside painting and learned studies. Rubens is one of these really extreme cases that helps to explain a much broader pattern, not unlike Church. He also built some really interesting domestic architecture. There are fleeting mentions in the archives to a couple of other houses about which we know nothing, but he owned over the course of his life at least 4 different houses, 3 of which were in the country, and one of which, shown here, was in the heart of Antwerp. And you can visit this place today, but it's mostly a reconstruction. So instead of showing you photos of the Rubenshuis in Antwerp, I've shown you these useful engravings from the 1600s that show, again, the prolificness of this artist-architect, this painter-architect, and the way this particular artist's house performed the artist's learning and made a particular claim on a buying public. So what you see here, and I believe you'll be able to see my cursor here on my own screen, is an elaborate exterior decorative program. These are painted friezes, not sculpture, but rather painting, which, as you might not be surprised, has not survived over the years. That shows a progress from vice to virtue. I think I have one more image here where you can see parts of the building that are original. I snapped this picture on an ancient digital camera back in 2008, I think it was. The ceremonial portico in the heart of the garden at the Rubens house, and most importantly this, which is original, the garden portico, inside of which is a great figure of Hercules. And you'll see that in this painting here by Rubens that I showed you on the first slide, the garden portico. I click back here to suggest that there's this interesting narrative in this house where you go from vice to virtue. Rubens was deeply learned in the Roman revival of Stoicism under Seneca, and he participated in this moment of revival that's known as Neo-Stoicism. He was a kind of philosopher himself. And for Neo-Stoics, Hercules was a particularly important example of virtue triumphant over vice because of parts of the Hercules story where he is drunk, laden down by his own iniquity, and then slowly triumphing through his labors. And then here in the garden pavilion rather, triumphant at the end of this long journey. So Rubens here is creating this showpiece house, a house in the heart of the city where he can receive clients. There are lovely anecdotes. The Danish doctor named Otto Sperling came to visit the great painter, one of the most famous men of his time, and found Rubens seemingly candid in his studio, working on a painting while dictating a letter in Latin and being read to from Tacitus. So this performance of learning and this capacious brain. And he shows you all of this on the outside of his house, his learning, the sculptures with which he surrounds himself. And you'll see where I'm driving towards Olana here, one key point, the collection. That was a core part of this house, the bust of Seneca that we know was in his collection, an important collection of European Renaissance paintings, as well as some ancient Greek and Roman artifacts that have later traveled into the collection of the Earl of Arundel and have had this long afterlife again in England. So I mention all of this to point to an example, a supreme example of a worldly successful artist, a skilled businessman, might sound like some people we know, who created this incredible place for showmanship and salesmanship, a place where people could be received by the great man, see his practice and process, and potentially buy an example of his work. So Rubens's city house there is an important precedent for Olana, I would argue. We also see the way that even that house that's in the heart of the city, you can look this up on Google Maps and see the buildings of this period that crowd right around the Rubens house. He's instead depicted it as miles out in the middle of nowhere. He's imagined it as a country house already, with that lush greenery beyond, instead of the wall of the neighboring house that would be right behind the figures there. So he's already driving toward something that he would achieve only a little later, this tremendously important country house. This is a painting I harp on about if you've heard me speak before. This is a painting that is a really useful, all too often missing link between the Italian Renaissance and the 19th century US, because it travels and it carries with it some of these ideas. So we can trace this really important painting of Peter Paul Rubens working at his great country house, Het Steen, which means the stone. You see that at the left there with its famous medieval tower, the tower that gave it its name, this great stone tower there. This castle that carried with it the title Lord of Steen, so an example of this social achievement of a very successful artist, using that place, that foothold in the country, to turn to the practice of landscape. So this painting travels to England. This painting carries to England an artist who has secured virtuous retirement, maybe neo-Stoic leisure after a long, hard career politicking in the great courts of Europe, making these religious pictures and flattering portraits. And then for pleasure, at the very end of his life, 4 years before his death, if memory serves, he's able to turn to landscape. He's able to embrace the pleasure of landscape practice and to make this great celebration of this kind of global landscape. You'll see what we call atmospheric perspective, the world tapering away to blue in the distance. You almost see the curvature of the earth there, expanding all the way out to the horizon. And one could go on and it could say more in the questions about the neo-Stoic cycles here, death and life and rebirth and so much happening. This painting goes to the collection of Sir George Beaumont, Baronet, an important amateur artist, an important patron of the arts, particularly important friend and patron of John Constable. John Constable, an important friend of Thomas Cole, the teacher of Frederic Church. So art historians are sometimes accused of building up these great extrapolations from the thinnest of evidence, mere supposition, just creative looking. But here we can really pin this down. We can put Thomas Cole in the same room as this painting. We can trace it into that English collection where it was available to visiting American artists for generations. So there's a reason why we focus on it. Now I want to travel to the US. So we've gone from the 1600s in the Low Countries to England of the 19th century. And for time, I'm not going to go on about John Constable, fascinating artist, really important. But let's go one step farther. Here we have another useful linchpin. And this is an artist who I suspect will not be known to most of you. And I will hope to convince you that he's a really important precursor for church, that there are a number of interesting things that are happening here on the shores of the Delaware River, just north of Philadelphia, where the Neshaminy Creek meets that great waterway, another Hudson, another major economic engine of early America, that there are a number of things that are happening here that also happened later at Olana. Here, we can't say that church was ever in the same room as William Birch. We can't say that church was definitely aware of this watercolor, for example, this original. I do think it's very likely that Frederic Church would have been aware of a really interesting publication by William Birch called The Country Seats of the United States of North America, an early collection of printed views and an early celebration of a domestic ideal that would be pervasive for the 19th century. So what we see here is visionary architecture. At left, this kind of oddly stretched building is a building that Birch referred to as his Green Lodge for shelter, the first building on the site and the only building on this site when he made the picture. But he's given us a vision of what was to come and what would eventually be completed over years of bankruptcy, sale, later repurchase, and sale again. A central house there, after which the Green Lodge at left would become a gallery of paintings, another artist's house, another artist's country house, well north of the city and in what was the country at this time, that was formed around an important collection that had important messages to share about the artistic labor being done there today. I've heard some claim that the collection of European paintings that was housed in the Green Lodge at Springland was the most important collection of European paintings in the early US, that is late 18th, early 19th century, a really unusual collection of an artist who was born in England, comes to the United States as a young man, a story not unlike that of Thomas Cole and Thomas Moran, so many others. And in the US spends this long, hard career trying, without a whole lot of success, to convince Americans to care about landscape. A very early precursor for Cole, for Church. And it's fascinating to me that a core part of this enterprise was the construction of a model house. And we know that he was thinking of this house as specifically a model. And if I click around in my notes here, I'll be able to give you the quote that he was specifically thinking of this house as a kind of program for a new continent, a place that would have lessons to share. He wrote all these poems about Springland, a place that would teach Americans how to venerate their own landscape, how to admire the way it was formed by the divine and not the way it needed to be formed by man. So let's see if I can find this quote. He called it a sample to serve the country. There's the resonant quote I was looking for. He builds this rather ambitiously as a fairly unknown artist as specifically a test case that he hopes will have a long afterlife. And I believe it did. Here's the title page of The Country Seats, collection of views I mentioned at left. He includes the view from Springland as the frontispiece of his book, in addition to much reproduced images of Mount Vernon, so many other great houses of the early US. He includes his own view, the view from his own house, celebrating it in reproductive media there. So he also, at this early date, is designing a planned landscape around it. And I have some quotes from that planned landscape. You probably won't be able to make out at this scale quite what he's up to here. But we know that he's specifying there is a kitchen garden, a farmyard, a potato garden, and a sheep pen in this relatively small pot of land, no 250-acre site this. He is envisioning a ferme ornée, an ornamental farm that is both productive and beautiful. You see that from the sinuous paths. He even envisions Neptune's garden, a little waterwork there. So grand visions for an ideal landscape that would both support the family that inhabits this place and be beautiful for painting. So I think you'll see why this seems such a striking example to me. He, in poetry, a medium that after hearing this poem, we might be glad that Frederic Church did not favor, he gives us some of his goals for this place and a kind of program for an American country house. He describes coming upon the site of Springland. A few steps within a spacious covert awaked my soul. My astonished eyes beheld a second paradise in view. High groups of massy chestnut grew. Here and there a lawn of grass uninterrupted grew, amidst a general shade. What I hear in these words is a naturally occurring landscape garden, this great trope of early America. We hear tales that the forest of America had trees that naturally grew so far apart that you could drive a carriage through them. And that's the metaphor, that's the measuring stick for landscape quality in this period. The American landscape seems like a naturally occurring park. So Birch is presupposing a kind of preservative landscape practice for an artist country house, one that would largely keep what is already there and merely beautify it a little around the edges. I want to point to how Church did a little different enterprise at Olana, how he is usefully different from what Church is up to. We're getting toward the heart of matters here, and I know time is moving on, and I could go on all day about Birch and Rubens and more, but I want to start showing you what all this is for, how it helps us to understand Olana better. So we already know, you who are supporters of Olana, friends of Olana, I'm sure already know that great story that Frederic Church was the prodigious star student of Thomas Cole, the artist who is so often given the epithet father of the Hudson River School. What you may not have seen is this really unusual painting where Thomas Cole's career began. And I point to this to show that his career also begins with this ideal of the country house. This very strange, some would say mercenary practice of depicting a rich man's possessions for pay. And you see the house of George William Fanshawe blown up there at right, not far from Schenectady, now we pronounce it Featherston Haw State Forest. But believe it or not, they pronounce this surname Fanshawe in period. Nothing of it remains but a really remarkable wood frame house where Cole was a kind of court painter, made a number of these house portraits, inherits some ideals of country life from that patron. You may also know the tales our friends tell across the river at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, a building largely unchanged by Thomas Cole, who never had the financial security of Mr. Church, but had great dreams and did deserve this title of painter-architect like William Birch, like Peter Paul Rubens, like Raphael. I've included an intriguing drawing for what he hoped to build on the site of Cedar Grove, an Italianate villa with a great tower, the tower being another precedent that recurs. But he's also thinking at grand civic scale in his buildings. At top left, an intriguing study for the Ohio State Capitol building I discovered along the way in my research. And the Ohio State Capitol building as it stands in Columbus today is largely the work of Thomas Cole. And this has mostly been forgotten. He won third prize in the competition to design it, but Alexander Jackson Davis kind of stole his design and co-opted it and built it somewhat modified. So he is thinking at grand civic scale. He's thinking at domestic scale. He's executing at an even smaller than domestic scale the new studio that, as you probably know, was recently reconstructed. Hurrah for that over at the Cole site. But even late in his life, he's still making house portraiture. The Van Rensselaer Manor House up top there at right in the collection of the Albany Institute of History and Art. So he's thinking about elite domestic architecture as an ideal toward which he strives, but can never fully achieve. He's thinking about the towered country house, an ideal inherited from Rubens and beyond, a place that gives you an observatory over the landscape, but never fully achieving that dream. Next is the section of my talk where I tantalize you with things that are utterly and completely lost. And it's a really sad part of the story. Again, Olana is ever present. And one of these many, many reasons why Olana is so important is that it helps us to understand these lessons transmitted through a number of others. I had one other slide there, but you already know this drawing well. Church's own tribute to the place of Cole, the domestic landscape of Cole, and the one building he built there. This is a fascinating place that I would love to learn more about, the house of Albert Bierstadt. That does actually come before Olana. Malkaston and Irvington, now absorbed into Terrytown, not so far away. Carpenter Gothic monstrosity, some might say. There are tales that you could exit onto bare earth from 3 different floors of the house, I think it was, and you can see sort of here how it's nestled into the hill. So it's emerging from the landscape, and then has high atop it this tower, this cupola, where you can look out over the landscape below. Completely lost to fire. Bierstadt dreams big, has some early financial success, loses that success, and doesn't have enough of a buffer to survive the fall. So this house is first leased out to other renters, and then very soon after it's leased out, goes up in a blaze. And some have suggested that might have been insurance fraud. And I see a number of instances of possible insurance fraud as you tell the story of artists' houses and early American country houses in general. But we may never know. Completely lost, but I'll show you a few other intriguing images of the interior. And we see again the collection as a core part of the function of these places. We see Bierstadt with his particular market segment, distinct from that of Church, this competitive market economy in which Church was a participant and in which Olana, we can't forget, was a participant. It was a claim on a market. It was making an argument for a buying public. And that argument is very specific and legible. And it becomes more legible when we look at the argument that Bierstadt was making. And I think even at this scale, even through grainy stereograph cards, you can make out what is happening here, what Bierstadt's brand is. And that's as a purveyor of authentic Native American truth. And this is obviously laughable to us today. He is no anthropologist, and his cultural assumptions are problematic, but he was fascinated by this mythical, vague idea of Native Americans. He's buying up willy-nilly the art of many different tribal cultures of the American West. And it's as the painter of the West, as you probably know, he makes his claim. So you'll see a Tlingit blanket there, a really fascinating object. You'll see tomahawks and all manner of other objects on the walls, garments, beaded garments, beautiful objects lining the walls of Malkaston, which means painter's box in German. And he was also using these accoutrements at his 10th Street studio building studio, just as Church did. You make your great showpiece in the city, surround it with the claims to your brand of artistic truth, and then invite the public of the big city into your studio to see your latest productions. The country house is no different. The country house is also a place lined with those claims to authenticity, the sources of inspiration. And we can't know what that place would have felt like. We can't really know how light moved through it because it is lost. But Olana helps us to understand the culture that gave rise to it. Just a few years later, 1867, Malkaston, 1872, the core of the main house that Olana completed. Very close rivals in this art market, and their country houses are close rivals too. Jasper Francis Cropsey, another part of this milieu, and I promise we are going to get right to the heart of matters before long. All of this is to show what is characteristic about Olana, to show also what is unique about Olana. This is not a country house, but this is a work of a painter-architect. This is the Herald Square station of the New York 6th Avenue Elevated Railway, designed by none other than Jasper Francis Cropsey. Fascinating person, one of the only artists of this or any period who was not a citizen of the Republic of Letters dabbling in architecture on the verge of the professionalization of that trade and having a go at it before people really needed proper credentialing. Rather, this is the work of somebody who was first and foremost a professional architect. And this is often forgotten because the afterlives of Jasper Francis Cropsey have made him first and foremost a painter of the Hudson River School, and a really important one at that. You should all get on Google Images at some point and look up the Storuca Viaduct in the Toledo Museum of Art, one of the masterpieces of the Hudson River School, fascinating painting of the works of man in optimistic harmony with the works of nature, a kind of apologia for industry, optimistic proclamation of manifest destiny in the wilderness. Really rich, really problematic, really fascinating. But he has this whole other legacy as a practicing professional, indeed civic architect. He's making country houses, but I show you his railway stations to show just how practical, just how practicing he was. He's learning landscape draftsmanship through serving out a professional apprenticeship in an architectural studio. And that is giving him the structural understanding, that deeper mathematical knowledge of how buildings work to make structures like this one. So he's a particularly extreme example that again helps us to realize how these two arts were such fellow travelers by the 19th century. There's a longer history here that we sometimes call the paragone, the rivalry of the arts. There was a one paragone of sculpture and painting, and this argument, this whole literary dispute about which was the superior art. And then there's a whole rich tradition of architecture versus painting that goes back to the Italian Renaissance. Cropsey is this really intriguing fusion of the two. So I think it's useful to point out that for an artist who was part of this, sometimes described as landscape boom in the 19th century US, it was perfectly natural to be building a railway station as well as painting the Storuca Viaduct. So Cropsey's house, another, I promised you tantalization, and here it is. This is the best image we've got of a house that no longer stands. That was near the town of Warwick, not far from Greenwood Lake. This was called Aladdin. So again, we have a precursor, not a precursor, this is a follower of Olana. We're now getting a little bit later. A direct follower of Olana, not only in its artistic ambition, but also in its Orientalism, associating that aura of Middle Eastern romance with a country house. We have some drawings that probably pertain to Aladdin. As you'll see from the caption here, this drawing in the MFA Boston is just described as summer cottage. We believe, though, that it is probably an early stage design for Aladdin. You'll see the large northern window there. That's a characteristic feature of the new studio at the coal site, as well as Olana. And then we see at right a reconstruction, the best experience of what that place would have felt like at the later retirement house of Cropsey and Hastings-on-Hudson called Everest. Very different, much reduced, but it does preserve some of the original interior furniture designed by Cropsey and some of the interior structures. You'll note up top in my photo here the cupola that carries over from Aladdin. So the idea of making a grand central painting space in which to create your work and also to receive potential buyers of your work. So Cropsey, again, this incredible example that is now lost, and Ilana perhaps helps us to understand it a little better. Cropsey, we can't pass without noting, is also the extreme example of intensively using that country house to depict a particular landscape of Greenwood Lake right nearby, but that's a topic for another day. Yeah, actually, that's a favorite painting in the Newark Museum. Like, I could go on about that one at some length, but you'll have to go down there and see it for yourself someday. We turn at last to Ilana, and I know this must be frustrating to hear about Ilana so late in an Ilana Perspectives talk, but I hope you'll see why there's good reason for this. I start here to show Church's painter-architect. Church's architectural drawing at left, certainly collaborating with Calvert Vaux most importantly, but also making many highly refined, highly skilled and feasible architectural drawings of his own for this great house. So we see that disciplined practice there. There's also substantial evidence in the Olana archive of his response to great works of architecture elsewhere in the world, particularly the Parthenon. So he is clearly a student of architecture. I would argue he absolutely deserves that title of painter architect, as well as obviously deserving the title of landscape painter / landscape architect, doing fascinating work in earth and water, as well as bricks and mortar. Olana is special. Olana is a place that we know and love so well, and I hope that you'll see on top of this body of evidence the ways in which it is typical and also the ways in which it is unique. So I'd like to sketch out some of those ways for you here before we turn to some discussion. There are a number of precedents that you've heard me talk about. We've seen this received memory that a great collection is a perfectly legitimate and important part of the functioning of an artist's house. Back to Rubens, back to William Birch. Even in this country in the early 19th century, we see one of these pioneering artist country houses being formed around a characteristic collection of paintings from Europe. So that's one reason why I think we need to pay a little more attention to the dining room at Olana. This evidence that there is a received wisdom that a great collection of European paintings for Rubens, for Birch and others is a way of claiming very clear descent in your domestic environment from that tradition. We see with Bierstadt building up the decorative arts, the artifacts of other cultures, other parts of the world to claim your own authenticity and to show your sources of inspiration, the way you have drawn your artistic truth. And we absolutely see that at Olana too. With his Middle Eastern art, with his pre-Columbian art and the studio works that he believed to be from before the time of Columbus, most of which are later reproductions, but nonetheless received by Church as products of an earlier era. He's building up this domestic environment around a collection, so that I hope helps us to understand the function of those interior spaces, not just as mood setting, but as a core argument he's making for a market that expected that kind of gesture. The towers of Olana, the towers that are now celebrated with the Olana eye, that camera giving us a view from atop those towers. We see that as a precedent with Malkaston, with Aladdin, with Cole's ambitions for Cedar Grove never fully realized. And then of course, back to Rubens, that medieval tower at Het Steen, that was this great moment in the memory of a generation, of generations plural, to follow of artists. There are also all these sources of landscape precedent for Olana. It's certainly an extreme and tremendously important example, but I'm fascinated to be able to point to a landscape plan with William Birch that is not so very different, except in its scale, from Frederic Joseph's very useful landscape plan that we refer to so often at Olana. Here too, we have the Fair Mornay. Here too, we have the kitchen garden, the mix of productive grid and sinuous curve for both pleasure and agricultural bounty. So we can argue about how much Church would have been aware of that. I think it's important and interesting to note that Church was working in a tradition that did have some precursors there. Now, the points of distinction. This is the last point, and I certainly wouldn't want anyone to leave this talk thinking that the curator at Olana is saying that Olana, this place we love, is merely typical, merely characteristic of something much larger. Olana is utterly unique. It is supreme. And there are a number of points of difference that in this whole context I've laid out here, hopefully help us to love this place all the better, to understand it a little better. Those points of difference. One of those points would be difference of degree. The ability to which Church could realize his dream, the scale of this landscape, really unusual for artists of any period. Certainly his financial acumen is a core part of that. But the breadth of the vision, the extent to which, as he tells us in his own words, now my art is road building, the extent to which he's thinking explicitly about landscape practice in 3 dimensions here is fascinating and different from anything I've seen before. Birch is doing a little bit of that, but Church is to this vast degree creating this immersive experiential environment of which that charismatic main house that often sucks up so much oxygen is just one small component. It's a part of this massive vision that is like no other. I'd also like to underline one key difference in the direction of the work at Olana. Birch has given us a vision of a preservative landscape. And by the time of Frederic Church, we see a restorative landscape where Church is explicitly engaged in an enterprise of landscape restoration on a place that was not received as a naturally occurring Edenic bounty, but rather a hard-used hilltop farm that have been largely cut over and needed Church's sustained planting effort with native species of trees to bring it back to a park-like setting. This elaborately man-made, laboriously worked landscape is distinctly different from what we see at William Birch's house and what we see from the evidence of such driving drawings at Aladdin as well. These were places that devoted their attention primarily to bricks and mortar, and then just enjoyed the landscape that was already around them, whereas Church is creating a new landscape here. Another difference that we point to at Olana is difference of inspiration. Yes, it's the case that Aladdin also shows some Orientalism, some vague notion of a Middle Eastern culture that had something useful to bring to late 19th century American architectural eclecticism. But with Frederic Church, we see this disciplined, lifelong practice of travel and reading that goes quite a bit farther than anybody else had before him. We see him buying up useful design inspiration the world over, responding to the domestic architecture of Syria with praise in his letters, building up a great library that gives him design inspiration. That preserved library is a tremendous source of insight into the differences of inspiration here, the product of an intrepid world traveler who was going to the source, going to the fount, and then bringing back this idea of a pan-Middle Eastern house that is of everywhere and nowhere but Olana. Another distinction of inspiration, a final point here, would be the scientific Olana. And this is something that I have not seen in the other artist houses that we go back to trace. Rubens had his learning in ancient history and Tacitus. Birch was learned in landscape architectural practice and the history of landscape art. Cole was acquainted with the new science of geology, but we have never seen another American artist go quite as deep into his devotion to the latest, most cutting edge, most rigorous scientific scholarship. And that's especially in the case of Alexander von Humboldt, whom we learned about in the last talk in this series. Church is making here a Humboldtian landscape that is attuned to differences of ecosystem at different elevations, making on a smaller scale perhaps than the Andes of Ecuador, a place that does reflect some of those lessons gleaned from deep devotion to Humboldt's cosmos. So that too, I would suggest, is a real point of distinction and a suggestion of what makes Church and what makes Olana so unique and so special. To conclude, I would argue that Olana is really the supreme realization of an ideal of the artist's house that spans centuries of history, received cultural inheritance. Olana helps us to understand the artist's house as not only a machine for living, that received term, but moreover, a way of knowing landscape. And we see that in this plan, we see this in Church's writings, a way of knowing, a mode of working, and a core component of the practice of an art of landscape across media. And I'll stop there and be very glad to take any questions and to get into some discussion.
Thank you, Will, very, very much. That was a whole lot to absorb and fascinating. Some amazing images there, and I certainly learned a lot myself. But thank you very, very much. I have a few questions, maybe to prime the pump. We do have a couple. Well, we have one question, we have one comment, so I'll get to those in a minute. But please, in the meantime, everyone, think away, send questions, send further follow-ups, whatever you might want. Talk about images you saw or you didn't see. But so Will, you know, one thing, I have so many questions here, but one, first I have to just say, I am such a believer or you know, sympathetic, empathetic with you about this idea of the restorative landscape at Olana versus the preservative that you, as you coin it, with Birch, and who I didn't know about before. So there's something I learned. But you know, certainly that I just think is very interesting, and you see very consciously. And I guess we could have shown the images that Church commissioned from Parton of the landscape, yes. Right? There's one in particular we have, it's a fairly small scale painting, but it's very landscape oriented. It's horizontal in the East Parlor that shows the view from the top of the hill, or I think it's more the studio site there, right. With a lot of logging happened, a lot of open land, and church planted up the site. So any case, that is something I think we should follow up in further, conversations. But question I would have, I guess the one I'll pick as others are coming in here is, it's fascinating to hear you talk about Rubens and about Stoicism and about this the progress from virtue to vice in his own designed environment there in Antwerp. But, what is the equivalent philosophy for you for church? Or is there a philosophy for church? And everything, question we get asked by everybody who comes, why Persian? Why the Middle Eastern thing? What's going on there?
That's a really interesting question. The initial answer is a blindingly obvious one that I'm sure has already occurred to everyone, just that church's philosophy is not philosophy, but natural science. That this is a rigorous scientific artist who is a Humboldtian to the core and who is trying to understand the natural world as a divinely ordered system of infinite complexity that has secrets to reveal to you if only you're willing to spend the time with it and travel through that landscape. I think that is a worldview, not merely a hobby. And I think it does take the place for church that Neo-Stoicism took for Rubens. That's something that dictated where he moved, how he lived, how he shaped his own domestic environment. So what about the Middle East? What was the Middle East to church? And this is a question for the ages, and this is something that we should focus on in a future exhibition. We have this challenging reality that Olana is the product of 19th century Orientalism, undeniably, that there is this romance of a mysterious othered Middle East that one cannot ever fully know. But I think the church went rather farther and was pioneering in trying to understand it on its own terms, and traveling widely through the region, through modern day Lebanon and Syria and Jerusalem, going to all these places to try to understand the historic domestic architecture of these places, and seeing a long history perhaps that he would have craved in the United States, and that's a frequent yearning of American artists of this generation. He's seeing a history that has long associations with Christianity, and that certainly was a part of his worldview. So by bringing all this history to bear in Olana, even if it had Islamic associations, he was drawing on antiquity, claiming descent perhaps from this long human history, but certainly also claiming unto himself all the romance, aura, mystery of that region.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, no, I think there's so much to unpack with the, Orientalism, with the travels in the Mideast and what was going on in the mid-19th century for Americans in particular, in my experience. So everyone, stay tuned. We're working on this. Yeah. We're having great fun unpacking it. I want to get to questions that are coming in from our audience. First, not a question. This is from Mimi. I'm going to maybe mispronounce it, Brauch or Brouch. Not a question, but a shout out to Newark Museum, a gem from a member of the Newark Museum, as well as an Olana member down the hill. Thank you, Mimi.
Lovely. Yes, thanks for the shout out. I see you've used the new acronym, the recently rebranded Newark Museum of Art, no longer just the Newark Museum. So
okay. All right.
Core. They were for a long time. They're also a science museum, and a very thorough one at that. So now they've gone full with gusto for the art, and it's a very special place that everybody should try to get to, including one of Church's masterpieces, Twilight Short Arbiter Twixt Day and Night. So got to get down there.
Absolutely. Great. And from Rick Sharp, our former chair and wonderful longtime supporter, why would Church's passion for architectural design not be reflected more in architectural structures in his paintings?
That's a very interesting question, and it's a hard question. And I'm glad that I also have access to the Q&A interface here, so I got a preview of it, and I've had a chance to collect my thoughts, and I think I've got an answer for you, Rick. We can both point to the paintings that are explicitly architectural, like the Parthenon, that is the product of architectural study for sure. And we have intriguing documents in the Olana collection that help us understand how that came into being, including this fascinating photograph that will hopefully be in a future exhibition on the photography collection of Olana, in which Frederic Church has taken a photograph of the Parthenon by his former student, the pre-Raphaelite painter, photographer, journalist, William James Stillman, and drawn on it to extract useful information, to help in translating its perspective to paint, making sure you get precisely the truth of that icon of ancient building practice. So I think that is an example of in paint Church as painter architect. The other way of answering it might be to engage with our colleagues at Peebles Island, the Bureau of Historic Sites, and to do some further conservation study of how Church is building up his finished works in oil on canvas. Because I wonder if we might find, when we look closely at the work of this painter architect, that we see something similar to the work of Caspar David Friedrich in 19th century Germany, where you'll see a lovely romantic landscape with what seems to be a mere afterthought of a church in the background. And then when you bring infrared reflectography to bear, you find that the rest of the picture is only the vaguest of delineation, but there is the most meticulous of architectural drawing for that church. And you start to understand the value system that underlies that picture. So perhaps we might find some surprises along those lines in the work of this passionate student of building.
That's a fascinating suggestion. I mean, I'm thinking of Cole's The Architect's Dream. What is the date of that relative to Church's involvement with Cole?
Yes, it's a little earlier. I believe it's around 1840. So it comes well before Cole, before Church comes to Cole. But if memory serves, the New Haven architect Ithiel Town declined it, was unhappy. He wanted a nice green landscape by Cole, and so it was in Cole's studio by the time Church was there.
Try doing architecture for an architect. That's a losing battle, but
yeah.
And I have also, Howitt talks about in his biography of Church, talks about the Church took a class or so in architectural drafting.
That's right.
Before he made the trip in, to the Mideast. And I tend to see that as a real sort of turning point from almost the Humboldtian kind of core to something that was different that we haven't quite well defined yet. I think the Detroit exhibition was working on that and got somewhere with, where does that travel and that painter's pilgrimage, as they called it, factor into our understanding of Church and, his moment. But yeah, I think architecture plays a much bigger role than we have hitherto acknowledged. So a couple other questions have come in, and anyone else, please ask away. A recent speaker in our virtual series, Christine Oaklander, hi Christine, says, great talk. Bierstadt, Moran, and Church are often discussed together. Can you speak to a Moran house or landscape?
Sure, that's an interesting question, and I think it will also give me a way of getting to another question I see popping up there, a request to talk more about Isabel Church from our friend Karen Zukowski.
Our friend, our trustee, yes.
Yeah,
and our former longtime curator. Yes. Hi, Karen.
So the way I want to piece these two together is that Moran, Thomas, that is, helps us to remember that there's always this other party that too often risks getting overshadowed by the financially successful world striding, often male painter architect striding the world. And with Thomas Moran, we have the real talent of the household, Mary Nimmo Moran. Incredibly important painter, worth a Google. And the house they built together is not one I know very well, but I do know it's both the work of Thomas and Mary Nimmo. So that will remind us that there are always two parties contributing here, and there are clearly more stories to be told there. We're engaged in this strange period in a campaign of editing, revising, enhancing the representation of the Olana ecosystem on Wikipedia. And I've personally been engaged in edit battles around the Wikipedia page of the so-called Thomas Moran house on Wikipedia. I keep on trying to enter the name. It's also Mary Nimmo's house, and she was a really important contributor, but the Wikipedia powers that be keep on denying that edit. So we have an uphill battle here. We have some work to do.
Well, that's one of the most newly restored artist homes and studios, right out in East Hampton, I believe it is.
That's right. Yeah. So
another kind of, quirky place with that little turret stuck into the middle of it or something. Again, the architects and the painter architects and their turrets and towers, you know.
Yes, there you go. That's a useful connection. And then another site of generations of artist houses. We can also talk about the Pollock / don't forget, Krasner house down that way. So transcending gender lines, transcending centuries. To bring this back to Karen's question, what was Isabel's role at Olana? A really important question when we're thinking about every single day, when we think about every time we give a tour, when we think about, especially when we get into the sitting room, is how inevitably was this domestic environment shaped by Isabel too? And we're starting to have some answers there. We're starting to have some suggestions. The provisional answer that Ida has helped us to understand a little better is the evidence that is still being pieced together, but promising evidence that the Carnes family was deeply engaged with the China trade, and that which is of Chinese extraction in the house, and there's some really interesting Chinese art, Chinese furniture in the house, might have been the influence of Isabel and Isabel's family. So the most important thing there being the so-called Chinese bed on the second floor that we're just starting to understand better. So that's my hypothesis, but I welcome all your help if we can piece together more of this story. It is certainly the case that she was playing a role in the lived experience of this house, and we'd love to understand more. There's just not as much evidence as we might like.
There are a few sort of wonderfully fascinating, sort of tantalizing tidbits in letters, I think, right? There's one where he talks about during the design, I can't remember if he's writing to Orestes Dow Palmer or Osborne, but he's saying, you know, Isabel and I were up all night pouring through stencils and patterns and, you know, the interior decor and design. And then, of course, her diary in the Holy Land of the travels that they took in the Mideast is full of possible sort of resonance with the design of the house, I think. Absolutely. So that's something we should bring out more. And then I think Downey did an interview, their daughter, Isabel, known as Downey, where she said, you know, everyone talks about my dad, but, you know, mother was very important in this process. So absolutely, you know, and I think and that goes back, you know, the wonderful thing about Church is that he's such a charismatic and important and interesting and ever evolving onion of a figure in American culture. But, you know, we can't at Olana, as you pointed out, Will, lose track of the other stories that are to be told on our site. Right. So that's important. And, I think we're about 10 minutes past time, so we'll sign off. But I want to end with Liz Hobby, who says, not a question, just to say, I enjoy Will's knowledge and passion in his presentation. And thank you. Amen, or as you will. Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you, Will, very much.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.